Hello, and welcome to the Building Podcast. The Building Safety Act came into full force in April 2024. It was a direct consequence of the Grenfell disaster, where 72 people lost their lives, primarily due to failures within the construction sector. It aims to make our buildings safe for our customers through personal responsibility. This is being driven by a statute on an individual competency, both on site and in the office, coupled with organisational competency. In every case, someone will have to sign to confirm compliance with the Act. This is where this personal responsibility comes in. We expect this Act upon to drive culture change within construction and to make us all aware of why we build and the values to which we must aspire. I'm really pleased then to be able to welcome James Butcher to the Building Podcast. James is the Director for Strategy and Operations at the National Federation of Builders. The Act has been in full force for nearly a year, and James has been advising members of the National Federation of Builders who are at the sharp end of implementation. And he's therefore the ideal man to come and talk to us about how it's being implemented and how it's struggling or where it may need some improvement. James, welcome to the Building Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Mark.
James, really looking forward to today's conversation. This is the biggest disaster in a generation that's driven the biggest change in statute for our industry in a generation. And I suppose we have to remember it's not just Grenfell. There's been a number of disasters that we've had which have created and all led up to the Building Safety Act. So it's a big piece of change that the industry is slowly getting to grips with. And I think looking to understand that's going to be quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's probably a wider question here, which is actually the challenges that the Building Safety Act has set out to solve, are some of those challenges actually responsible for the flaws in the construction business model? You know, building buildings to regulations and ensuring that people are responsible and accountable for their actions across the supply chain and within all the businesses that operate in that supply chain. That's not really revolutionary, but it obviously was the government had considered, and I think we as an industry accept that was required. So perhaps as well as the minimum safety standards, which in our industry is the building regulations, and that's what the Act is all about, ensuring adherence and compliance to, perhaps actually we'll see other benefits to the way that our businesses operate and the success of construction industry in the longer term future as well.
Well, let's come on to those because I think there's some really meaty points around that. But before we start, do you want to just explain to listeners how come you've got this first-hand knowledge and what the day job involves in supporting NFB members?
Of course, yeah. My as you said, my role is strategy and operations at the NFB, but I've been at the NFB for just about 5 years, and until the last year or so have been in the policy team at the NFB. And so one of the functions that the NFB provides members with, and we represent builders, contractors, and house builders across the UK. One of the functions of our association is ensuring that our members are, up to date, up to speed with regulatory change, their statutory responsibilities, engaging with the process that creates those new laws and what have you. And so obviously it is a role for us to ensure that we advise members on how that they can navigate new changes. And the Building Safety Act, as you have said, is the biggest change in a generation. And so it's absolutely essential that at the NFB we have not just me, but a team of probably 3 or 4 others that have good working knowledge of the Building Safety Act and can advise members. And that, that's from online webinars, bespoke training sessions, in-person seminars, a suite of guidance, and then reactive questions that we get all the time as people work their way through applying the Building Safety Act to their operations.
And I mean, how well understood do you think the Building Safety Act is amongst NFB members? Is it widely understood now that with all this work's going on, or do you think the industry as a whole is still struggling to come to terms with it?
No, I think the industry is still struggling to come to terms with it, but in a positive sense. It's because there's been so much change in a short space of time, and when you look at what the Building Safety Act tried to achieve, there's quite a considerable amount of change in that legislation,
Hmm.
and that was only the start of it, because we then saw a whole raft of secondary legislation, changes to the building regulations, etc., etc. And to give you an example of some of the things it did, it created an entire new higher risk building control regime. It
Hmm.
changed the building control regime for all other construction work. It created three new regulators, including the building safety regulator. It made building control professionals a registered profession. It increased the powers for the Architects Registration Board. It created new duty holder roles. As you said in your
Yeah.
introduction, it created new competency requirements, both for individuals and capability requirements for businesses. It changed the Defective Premises Act. It introduced, or will introduce, the Building Safety Levy, updated the Fire Safety Order, and created new accountable persons for the occupation phase of high risk buildings. And that's just to start with.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a huge, huge piece of legislation that did an awful lot. And of course, because our industry is made up of SMEs, because we have a long supply chain, it's going to take time for people to navigate that. But I started this comment by saying that it's done so in a positive sense. And what I mean by that is that for an organization our size, we have never seen so much engagement of our
Mm.
members wanting to know and understand their new roles and their new responsibilities. So I would say the industry is stepping up, but that the changes came in before people knew what they were going to be, and therefore there is a bit of catch up. But I think the government and the regulator expected that. And so our task is to ensure that the gap between what your responsibility is and you ensuring that you confidently comply with it, because I'm fairly certain that most people are complying with it, but perhaps not confidently.
Yeah.
We need to close that gap as quickly as possible. And that's what I think everyone in the industry is working to achieve at the moment.
Mm. And I think, I mean, it's really good to hear, James, that we are generally complying with it, and that we're getting to grips with it. Do you want to just talk through about the one of the big original misnomers about it? They only apply to buildings above 18 meters that people were living in, um, whereas it actually applies to all construction work. And I think that's one of those things that we just need to be sure we've absolutely explained to people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the big ticket item, obviously, because just to just to recap, as you said again in your introduction, 72 people died in the Grenfell Tower fire, and another 70 were injured. And it wouldn't surprise me if there are people whose lives are cut short because of the injuries that they sustained, or the secondary effects of exposure,
Mm.
etc., to the fire itself. And that's to say nothing of all the mental, emotional,
Yeah.
psychological harm that would have been created in this. So this was a seriously big issue and disaster that we needed to do justice to solving and ensuring that, to the best of our ability, that didn't happen again.
Mm.
So the big ticket item of the Building Safety Act is it created this entire new regime for higher risk buildings. And in the course of the legislation being created, as you rightly pointed out, the height of buildings was the determining factor, and its use. It has to have two or more residences, but
Mm.
effectively its height. If it had residential element to it, then it would have to go through this entire new approval regime, which is called the high risk buildings control process, and then created an entire new regulator, the building safety regulator, to ensure that there was a competent authority able to actually make sure that, as these really big complex buildings went through building control process and eventually the construction phase, and were eventually signed off and became operational, that that would be done properly.
Mhm.
Now, obviously, you can only fit so much on a press release. Ministers can only talk about so much in an interview. The discussion inevitably revolved around Grenfell and what we were doing to stop an issue like Grenfell happen again. But there was a second part to this, which is that after the Grenfell disaster, Parliament commissioned Dame Judith Hackett to undertake a review of building regulations. And as part of her review, part of her findings, she found compliance with building regulations to be woeful at every stage. And so the Building Safety Act, in response to her findings, decided that it was going to bring in this new duty holder regime and actually introduce the competency requirements that I think we're going to go on to speak about. But that applies to all building work. So any building work where you require building regulations, which is pretty much everything, now has a new or has an amended building control process, and it has these new duty holder requirements, including the individual liability that you've referred to at the top of the podcast, and then the competency requirements, which applies to absolutely everybody, not just the duty holders, absolutely everybody working on a construction site, and indeed those people not working on the construction site but in the back office, making sure that everything else works properly. Everybody has to be competent. So key message from today: the Building Safety Act and its new duties apply to every work, every construction site, every construction project where building regulations apply.
Yeah, and I think perhaps the other one that's worth bringing out then, James, is actually the requirement on clients as well, because clients play an absolute fundamentally crucial element in the new Building Safety Act.
Yes, they do. They do. Clients have a duty to appoint competent people to manage their their design, the building work, and then the occupation phase as well. So yes, the duty holders are the client, the principal designer, and the principal contractor. And there are some other duty holders under that. So there's general duties for designers, and there's general duties for contractors too. But yes, you're entirely right. Clients must be competent. They can't just say, this is what I want, go away and give it back to me at the end. It doesn't work like that at all. And they have a responsibility to be told about safety risk issues. They have a responsibility to interact with the regulator too. And then they have, for the higher risk buildings, they have ongoing duties to ensure that they're accountable people later on too. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And one of the differences, I think, in the response to the Grenfell disaster is that contractors and designers have stepped up and have started to develop the competencies of what these duty holding roles are. I think the clients are slightly behind, and I say that with the greatest of respect, but there is no publicly available standard on the client's responsibilities for the Building Safety Act, whereas there is for designers and there is for contractors.
Yeah. So I mean, it is they do, particularly the single clients, single projects. We're going to need quite a lot of advice and support to take them through their duties under the Act, and that is another piece of legislation or another requirement on clients, particularly who perhaps might not be familiar to construction work. Do you want to just quickly run through the key changes or key requirements on the other two principal named individuals, designers and contractors? Because that's in addition to CDM, and it is one of the other conundrums of the Act, is that we've got the same duty holders as we have under the construction design and management regulations, but it's a different approach that, despite picking the same people as part of who are named in the Act.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if you don't mind me correcting you, they aren't necessarily the same people.
No,
they're the same. They're the same titles,
the same names, yeah,
the same names, titles, but they're not necessarily the same people in the organisation. So, just like CDM, we have client duties, principal designer duties, and principal contractor duties, but thereabouts, that's where the similarities end. So, CDM applies to health and safety, and the Building Safety Act duties apply to compliance and adherence with the building regulations. So one is about literal health and safety, the other is about the building safety and ensuring that the building is safe and continues to be safe for the foreseeable future. And the way that we achieve that is with strict adherence and compliance to the building regulations. But yes, what are these new duties? Well, the principal designer now has new duties, and so does the principal contractor. And so principal designer's duties are to ensure that they have the necessary competence, and we will, as this podcast goes on.
We're going to go on to confidence, no doubt about it. Yep.
We will. But what I mean is you will hear me say again and again, you have a duty to ensure competence. So principal designer has to ensure that they're actually competent to do the work. They have to make sure that they plan, manage, monitor, coordinate all of the design work, that they take reasonable steps to ensure that the designers that work for them comply with their duties. They have to make sure that the design work that is produced complies with building regulations. They have to work with the principal contractor to make sure that they are sharing enough information about the planning, managing, monitoring, coordinating of the design and build work, and they will have to have an active conversation with the principal contractor to ensure that anything that the principal contractor raises as concern is discussed and integrated into any changes to the design work. And just as we've been talking about client duties, they have to assist the client in providing information, and information exchange is a really big deal in the Act. That you cannot any longer have a situation where one duty holder knows something and the other duty holders don't. That will leave you liable for sure.
Yeah.
There are additional duties for principal designers that relate to higher risk buildings, and those are something called a mandatory occurrence reporting system, which basically makes sure that there is a formal occurrence system that reports specific concerns, specific risks up and down the duty holder chain, but also in some situations to the building safety regulator. They have to obviously store information digitally. So the golden thread, which you've probably heard about I know you've heard about in the press, but listeners have probably heard about in the press, that's the digital storing of building information. That has to be done for high-risk buildings. It is not mandatory for non-high-risk buildings. But then moving on to principal contractor duties, and again, I don't think these duties are not going to surprise anyone. I don't believe
they're not unreasonable, are they?
Absolutely not. No, they're not unreasonable. The key thing is just making sure that there are actually that they are actually fulfilled properly and by people who are able to do them. So much like the principal designer, principal contractors have to make sure that building work is done by a team that is competent in order to do so, that make sure that it complies with building regulations, never accept non-compliant work from the supply chain, work with the principal designer and share information. So if any design changes are needed, they need to make sure that that is properly communicated and discussed and actioned with the principal designer. Again, providing information to the client as well. And then, surprise, surprise, plan, manage, monitor and coordinate the actual building work itself so that it is compliant with building regulations. And then, much like what we've discussed with principal designer, they have the same duties as a principal designer when it comes to higher risk buildings too.
Yeah. Brilliant. I mean, quite comprehensive answer there, James. I mean, I suppose my next question is on the three regulators that have been created, because we're still waiting for a little bit about the construction product regulator, aren't we? Do you want to just talk a little bit about where we are with the three regulators that have been created by this process?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one, the one that everybody will know about, or at least should know about, and probably in regard to the work that the part of the sector that we represent at the NFB, the building safety regulator is the big ticket one.
He is, yeah.
So the building safety regulator sits within the health and safety executive, and it is responsible, as I mentioned before, for the building control process for high risk buildings. But more than that, it actually now has a statutory duty to oversee safety and standards of all buildings, because you've got to remember building control across the country is a patchwork of organisations. There are well-known big private providers of building control that actually have a lot of expertise, but local building control authorities are smaller, so it's not unsurprising that the building safety regulator has a kind of overall responsibility for that. And then a competency duty as well, so helping and encouraging industry to improve competence. Again, we'll come on to that. But the other two are, as you alluded to, the Office for Product Safety and Standards. One of the real revelations from the Grenfell disaster and the inquiry was the performance of building materials compared to how they were branded and marketed.
Yeah.
So it's not unreasonable at all. In fact, it was essential that a new regulator set up to ensure that the claimed performance of building and construction products
Yeah.
are actually met and what they say they are.
Mm.
And then the third one, which I'm afraid was somewhat tacked on, and it doesn't relate directly to Grenfell itself, is the New Homes Ombudsman. And basically that's a new ombudsman service that helps the consumer to resolve issues with the developer where the direct negotiations with the developer
It failed.
have failed.
Yeah. Mm. Okay. Well, I mean, let's come on to that big C word now, the competency, because that is something that we spent a lot of time talking on the Building Podcast around about skills and competency in the industry, and that's a statutory requirement that people are competent to do their jobs. And we've got quite a challenge to make sure there are enough of these people who are competent to do the jobs, but perhaps primarily we've got to describe what competence is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, just very over discussion around what makes a person or an individual competent for the work they're doing. Is a sort of defined structure or framework people work within?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked very briefly about culture change. What is the culture change? Because we've talked about very specific duties. We've talked about the creation of new regulators. The culture change comes in the competency requirements. And how do you use statute to change competency?
Yeah.
And the answer is that you define what competency is, but you leave it up to the employers to decide whether the people that they have in their staff and in their supply chains are actually competent to undertake that role. So there's no like magic framework that says this person must have this, and this, and then they can do this, and this. There are some under development, but they're not a statutory basis, and there is no way you can indemnify yourself as an organisation out of you ensuring that you have assessed an individual to be competent to do the work that you have asked them to do. So, in answer to your question, personal or individual competency is the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours of an individual to undertake their role.
Mm-hmm.
So where previously we've relied on a qualifications approach or a card approach, which by the way have their place and are very valuable and are very important, now we would say that those two things help to evidence competency, they don't prove it. There is no way to prove it other than for an employer to undertake on an individual level an assessment of an individual to the job that they are, or job or role that they're asking them to do. So does that person have the skills, knowledge, experience and behaviours to undertake that role? And you might say, well, that's a bit wishy-washy, and what's the government trying to achieve here? And it's a cop-out, isn't it, that you're passing that on to employers? No, it's not a cop-out. It's not at all. It's saying to employers that you need to take responsibility for the work that you undertake. Project work is completely different, and somebody might have a similar set of skills. They might have even a similar amount of knowledge, but they might have wildly different experience, and their behavioural pattern at work might be completely different too. And therefore, the competency of those two individuals to undertake different types of work will be completely different. You may well trust them to do something, but not to do something else. So competency now is the responsibility. Firstly, the individual has to be competent to do the role, and you now have a duty. If you believe you're not competent to do something, you have a duty not to do it and to tell the contractor that you can't do it. It's beyond your competency. But more importantly, the employer has a duty to ensure that they have assessed everybody's competency and that they have matched that up to the requirements that they're asking them to do.
Yeah. And I suppose for the avoidance of doubt, that means that you can have different competencies within a team to deliver a task. So, the employer can turn around and say you are competent within this team. You may not be competent within a different team. So it is, being an industry full of teams to deliver work. It is that if you like, that aggregation of skills and knowledge and behaviour and expertise within the team is what's required and what's important in many sites.
Absolutely. So let's take, for an example, what you mentioned earlier, which is the compliance statement. So at the end of a job, as part of the sign off, somebody has to sign a principal contractor compliance statement to say that, to the best of their knowledge, that the work has complied with building regulations. Now, that might be a project manager, might be a contracts manager, might be a site manager. It will depend on the business, and it will depend on the work type. You
Yep.
might have two project managers, and they might have the same level of seniority in the business, but because one has got 35 years of experience and the other was promoted last year, there will quite clearly be different jobs that it's appropriate for those project managers to be able to sign off as the principal contractor on those two jobs. So you will appoint one project manager for a particular job type, but you may well appoint another project manager for a different job type. So it literally is that case that you have to take an individual approach at this now.
Mm. And is that required, that assessment's required on a job by job basis? So I presume it's not dissimilar to the project risk assessments that employers are very familiar with in creating those teams and ensuring those teams are competent.
So competency is not fixed, right?
No.
So I don't think that it's realistic to suggest that you undertake a competency assessment for every job. I think that's
Too far.
that's too far. That's more than one is practical and two is realistic and three is what the Act was requiring. But it is, I would say, a requirement or an implicit requirement that you undertake a regular assessment of competency. So I would say that at worst that should be once a year, and probably ideal would be 6 monthly, something like that. And as that develops, as you undertake and reappraise that person's competency, you would start to get a picture of what they are capable of or aren't capable of. Most employers will already know what they are, without thinking about it, will already know what project
Yeah.
managers are suitable for what job types. The difference now is that you really need to record that, and you really need to formalize that, because if you were audited for that competency requirement, what proof other than going, I knew he was the right person for the job, or I knew they weren't quite right for the job? What do you have that backs that up? It has to now be, and we would strongly recommend a competency policy, much like you have policies for everything else, that you actually
Yeah.
enact, by the way, not that you just sign and, once a year take
It's
off
not
the
a
shelf.
paperwork exercise. Yeah.
Absolutely not. So you have a competency policy and you actually assess and record competency, on a year to
Yeah.
6 monthly basis, and make sure that clearly identifies who is competent to undertake what.
So that almost ties in with an annual performance development review, which a
Absolutely.
lot of organisations are very familiar with. Um,
Absolutely.
but I suppose my comment was, if you're looking to put a team together on one job to another job, then the requirements of those jobs, generally being the industry we're in, is varies from job to job, and so
Mhm.
understanding what the competencies are to respond to those issues is going to be quite it is can be considered quite a heavy exercise to go through.
Yes, and I suppose to some extent it is, but there are other things that will motivate you to do this anyway. So competency requirements is one, but commercial reality of whether the subcontractor you're appointing can actually deliver the job that you're appointing them to do is
Very
going
important.
to, you're going to come at this from more than one
Yeah.
aspect. You just need to make sure that when you make that assessment from a commercial reality point of view,
Mhm.
you also do it from a competency point of view. And
Yeah.
yes, it is added bureaucracy, but what happens when we don't have that sort of behaviour? The Grenfell Tower, and that can't happen again.
Absolutely, and we can't be there again. Does the same framework apply then to organisational competence as well, then, James? Are we looking at the knowledge, skills, experience, behaviours of organisations to be able to act appropriately and within the industry?
It's slightly looser, actually. So the terminology in the Act and building regulations is organisational capability, but the
Yeah.
principle is the same. And the definition is the capability of a business to perform its functions under building regulations.
Yeah.
And how you present this, and the NFB's position is that organizations are far more advanced when it comes to proving the capability of their business operations than they are individual competency. Because every time you go through a procurement process, you are being asked in your PQQs, or the common assessment standard is the one in vogue at the moment, for example, with its 100-odd questions or what have you. That is an example of proving organizational capability, And so if I go on your website, Mark, if I go on Evo's website and I scroll to the bottom, I bet you've got all the management accreditations, you've got all the trade associations you belong to, you've probably got a few policies advertised there. All of those things build up a picture of organizational capability. The challenge is this time is that what we're saying is it's the capability of the business to perform its functions under building regulations. But think about this in a holistic sense. So if you have a management standard, which knowing you, I expect you do. If you have a management standard, that management standard actually helps you to ensure that you are going to meet building regulations, because it means you've got the proper management processes in place to ensure that you're making assessments about who should do what job, etc. Blah, 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 blah. And no doubt those management standards have include things like regular appraisals and an appraisal process and a PDR process and all that sort of thing. So you can think about this in a broader sense than individual competency requirements.
Yeah, I think it's going to be quite a sea change to document, as you suggest, competency within the industry. But we simply cannot afford to go back to another Grenfell type disaster where clearly a lot of people within that supply chain, both in the office as well in design office, implementation office, and delivery, were not competent for the jobs for which they were there for. James, we talked around this act came to full force in April 1st last year, 2024. Since then we've had the Grenfell public inquiries returned its final verdicts, and we've had a government response to that inquiry. Do you want to just talk through how that might have changed some of the emphasis or priorities that we're facing as an industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So first thing first is this has been a significant amount of change, and people are only just getting used to it. I'm talking about the Building Safety Act. More changes coming. So the government, the Building Safety Act was a response to that Dame Judith Hackett review that we talked about earlier. So a review of building regulations. But the Grenfell inquiry was still ongoing. Now, in the course of the Grenfell inquiry and its publication late last year, the stage 2 report, there were quite a significant number of recommendations made. I think almost 60, something like that.
That's right. Yeah.
As to further changes that would help to improve building safety. The government's now considered those fully, and has, generally speaking, adopted most of them. So what that means is, where we have two regulators, as in the building safety regulator and the product regulator, the government is of the mind that should be one regulator. Now, how that works in practice is a little bit more complicated, because the government has also recognised that you can't have one regulator that sets and marks its own homework effectively, and that a separation between product and people is important. But nonetheless, there will be change. There is going to be a change to the regulatory picture and that environment, and that is going to see some changes in terms of the ministries that are involved and who is ultimately responsible for different things. Because at the moment we have a Department of Business and Trade is responsible for some things, MHCLG, Ministry for Housing, Communities, Local Government, is responsible for some things. I think the Home Office is responsible for others. It's too dispersed, so the government's going to bring it together. It's also, I'm afraid to say, is going to, and I say afraid to say because the government wants to review the definition of a high risk building.
Yeah.
So at the moment, that is set in law. So if the government wants to change that, it will have to legislate to do so. The great concern that I have here, and I think others in the industry have, is that the building safety regulator needs the resources in order to effectively police higher risk buildings. And at the moment, it by its own admission is way behind all of the currently identified high risk buildings that exist. So what is a high risk building? As you said, at least 18 meters in height or 7 stories high, contain at least 2 residential units, and not a building entirely used as a care home, hospital, secure residential institution, hotel, military barracks, MOD property. The government is going to look at that again. I think if it does that and it significantly changes the definition, we are going to have to see much greater funding for the building safety regulator. Building safety regulator is going to have to become an awful lot bigger in order to get buildings through the process, because unlike the normal building control process, there are 3 hard stops. So the building safety regulator has to look at each and everything individually, scrutinize it, assess it, approve it at these 3 hard stops in the process. So that change is coming, and I think people are only just getting used to the change that we've encountered now. So it is going to create uncertainty, and uncertainty to me is a worry, because that's when mistakes happen and things fall through the gaps. But the government's committed to it, so I would say that is going to happen. The other thing, big change I perceive, is that government looks like it's going to license buildings to undertake work on high risk buildings.
License building contractors, not buildings, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that is going to be a very, very different approach to anything that we've had before. What that looks like, who does the licensing, what the licensing is comprised as. We are going to see some significant changes. There are other changes that I think, I'm not saying that those aren't positive, but there are more positive changes, such as we're going to get a chief construction advisor again. We've had one in the past. It came out of the inquiry that actually one would be very, very useful. Having that kind of independent person to bridge the gap between industry and government and advise on various aspects, including safety and building regulations. So some positive changes, but some changes that will lead to a period of uncertainty. That period of uncertainty is likely to start mid this year, so mid 2025. How long it takes at the moment, we can't say.
No, I think it is a challenge, because there are certain developers who are struggling at the moment, who are not perhaps familiar with the legislation, particularly on high rise, and suddenly finding these stage 2 gateways, or the gateways they have to go through, are suddenly adding a great deal of time and probably not insignificant cost into taking their projects through the planning and the regulatory framework that we've now got.
No, absolutely. And I think how that works in practice, one of the challenges that we have at the moment is that people are playing it safe and sending buildings to the building safety regulator that aren't high risk buildings, and so it has to look at those and reject them. Complete waste of time. So we need to get to a better position where all of the parts of the building control process and the planning process, of course, because for the building safety regulator, the planning process is a key part of its control process. We need that to work better than it does now in order for this to be an efficient and effective process.
It's interesting you said. I mean, I can just imagine a number of funding credit committees looking at this and saying, well, what are the risks we've got? Well, it might be a high-rise building. Well, the only way we're going to make sure it's not a high-risk building is to send it to the building safety regulator to get it for them to determine that it's not. And you can see the credit committees saying, well, that's a risk that we need to get bottomed out. Hence the need to then swamp the building safety regulator in applications which may or may not be appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, the reason I said the whole process needs to work properly is because, let's say that we undertake a to build a high risk building, we don't decide whether it goes to the building safety regulator. As part of the planning process, that's decided.
Yeah.
Of course, we might identify it as a high risk building incorrectly, but if somebody in the planning department doesn't challenge that properly, then it will go off to the building safety regulator
Absolutely.
for
Yeah.
them to then go and scrutinise. So, we've got a lot to learn. There is risk that people will not notice the change in what is a high risk building, or that we come up with something that's not very clear when we redefine what a high risk building is. And our approach to risk as a country is the hierarchy of controls. You have tougher controls for higher risk.
Yeah.
I think I really hope the government doesn't change the definition based on what's popular, but actually does it based on what is genuinely higher risk, as opposed to chasing a headline, which would be very damaging for everybody, I think.
I think this government, or the UK generally, is evidence-based risk assessments, and certainly you look at the health industry, it's generally evidence-based, and we'd hope the same would apply to construction, albeit the consequences of failure are that much greater.
Yeah. If you don't mind, Mark, I just want to explore, and I think listeners might want to take this away and think about it, is how exactly a licensing scheme works and who it applies to.
So
And what
I'm
it
very happy
means
to have this
in
conversation. I
practice.
suspect there's another podcast once we get the basics out on the table, but let's
But
go
the
on. So
general,
how does a licensing scheme work for the National Federation of Builders then?
well, I'm not. We're actually against the licensing scheme, so I'm not sure
Okay.
it would work for us. But this is the challenge that I would put back to the government. So government says that it wants to introduce licensing scheme for principal contractors,
Yep.
based on the duty holder requirement process. Right? Fine. So far, so good. But can be withdrawn for failure to achieve compliance with the regulations. So let's say that happens. That's
Yep.
perfectly reasonable, effective thing to do.
Yep.
Who is banned? Is it the company? In which case, surely you just shut the company down and you start a new one. Is it the directors? Is it everybody who works for the company? It will be really very, very interesting to see how this begins and ends, who the license really applies to and who is barred. Because I
Yeah.
can see a situation whereby it just, as soon as your license is withdrawn, you shut the company down, you wind it up, you start again, same people.
Yes, I'm not sure that would hit my requirement for experience on the business, and that's that for running businesses, it's not dissimilar on competency for individuals. You need some experience. That organization experience needs to be earned, and that does take time. How long? That depends, but you see established businesses within construction generally surviving far greater uh, ill winds than new businesses coming in, and that's because they've got the scars and they've got the experience to do that.
Of course.
And that applies to Phoenix businesses as much as it applies to those long established or businesses. So I think there are ideas and solutions, and like all these things, it's not going to be perfect to start with, is it? I
No,
mean, I think licensing, as we've talked about previously, probably, but not on the podcast, James, that the licensing has different problems and different connotations
it
and
does.
challenges.
It does. And my real worry is that, having tried to persuade members and other people in industry that the Building Safety Act, by defining what competency is, but leaving it up to individual companies to determine whether their individuals and their supply chain are competent to undertake the roles and jobs that they're asking those people to apply to, which I honestly, hand on heart, see as a very, very good thing. And actually, in the longer term, achieving culture change, a licensing scheme potentially undoes that, because you either have a license or you don't. And that gets back to this tick boxing exercise, this tick boxing approach, whereby something is binary. And the truth is when it comes to competency and capability, things are not binary. Things are constantly moving. So I have some concerns about it.
It's one of the things I find fascinating about running this podcast, James, is joining dots that others perhaps might not have seen. And I'm reminded of probably 30 years ago. There was a long discussion about whether we should be licensing uh, yacht captains driving to be whether they should be licensed to be able to operate as a sort of offshore. And the theory went that you can't license somebody to be operating as because the variability that they're going to get thrown at is
Absolutely.
enormous.
Yeah.
And by awarding somebody a driving license for a yacht, they suddenly think, well, I've got a license, therefore I must be competent, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
therefore I go out in all weathers because I've got a license to say I'm competent. Whereas actually, the opposite is true. Perhaps the more experience you get, the more you realise you don't know. And
And look, I wonder if a yacht actually is a good analogy, because let's say you charter a yacht and the skipper has the license you're referring to. You don't know. You don't know that that skipper is only a fair weather skipper. You don't know that because they've shown you your license. And I think my concern with the licensing scheme is that the client sees the license and thinks, perfect, I've got what
totally,
I wanted, rather
yeah,
than really undertaking a rigorous assessment of the capability and competency of that organization that they're appointing. They just look at the license, they see a
yeah.
license and they think,
Uh,
great,
uh,
job done.
and the thing about our industry is it's all prototypes. Every building is
Absolutely.
different. It isn't.
Absolutely.
James, we've had a really good run through the Building Safety Act and the sort of the challenges you've got with NFB members and how it might change. Just sort of as my last sort of question, sort of the call to arms or the sort of the pointers for the future. What are the sort of one or two top messages you're giving NFB members in relation to the Act?
Yeah, of course. I've got more than one or two, but I hope you forgive. I hope you'll
We
forgive
haven't
me.
got all day then.
No, I appreciate that. So I'll be quick. So, firstly, recognise that the Building Safety Act applies to you. It definitely does. If you build buildings, it applies to you. Okay.
Yep.
Secondly, understand the difference between high risk building work and non-high risk building work, because if you understand that properly and we go through the high risk building process, some of the issues that we've talked about today will actually be ironed out and the process will work better.
Yep.
You also have a duty to understand the difference anyway, so I'm not telling you to do anything that you shouldn't I shouldn't otherwise be doing it. Understand your duties as duty holders. So if you're a client, understand what it is now your duty to do, and that is basically ensuring that you appoint competent people, but that you understand what that means.
Yep.
Make sure that if you understand your duties if you're a principal designer and also a principal contractor. And for principal contractors who undertake design and build contracts, you may well be asked to be the principal designer too. So make sure that you have the competency either within your organization or subcontracted to enable you to fulfill those duties.
Yeah.
Understand that complying with the building regulations now means that you must have competency in your organization. So please institute a competency policy and regular competency assessments, both for the staff that you work for, which will be that work for you, sorry, which will be much more thorough, but also make sure that you have a process by which you assess the competency of subcontractors too. Think about who you will appoint as individually able to sign compliance statements in the work that you do. So who is going to be the individual that signs a principal designer or principal contractor compliance statement? And make sure that if you work on HRBs that you specifically determine who in your organization is competent to do the HRB work, because it really will not be everybody.
Yeah. So HRB being high risk buildings because that's
Exactly.
yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
Review your organizational capability. So we talked a bit about that. You will definitely have a document that you probably submitted last week for a job that you're bidding for that at least partially sets that out. Be prepared to maintain that and upkeep that, but have in mind how that helps to show that you adhere to building regulations. And
Yeah.
then go and investigate the golden thread, the digital collection of building information, because everybody collects building information, not necessarily in the same way. If you work on a high risk building, you have to collect and store it digitally and it has to be accessible to everybody. That I can guarantee will become the industry standard and industry norm in the future. So think about how you collect, store and present building information and look to do it digitally as soon as possible. And then finally, there is a reason that trade associations like the NFB exist, and there are plenty of other alternatives that are not as good, but nonetheless they they exist, and therefore please lean on them. That's, you pay a fee or a subscription to join them. Go and ask them for advice, because if they're like me and my colleagues in the policy department, they will do this all day long, and therefore and that they don't know, they probably know someone in the regulator or in a building control authority, or they can connect you with a peer who can provide you with advice. And then, just as an anecdote to finish, we talked about, the Building Safety Act and affecting real change and culture change. The NFB has recently reworked its vision and mission, and I personally believe that the Building Safety Act has directly influenced our entire purpose for being at the NFB, because our vision is for an industry that is fit for the future, productive, purpose-driven, made up of professional people and companies. Now, from what we've discussed today, I would say being fit for the future is essential for the Building Safety Act. Being purpose-driven is essential. It's ethical behaviour, and made up of professional people and companies. That's exactly what the competency requirements are for. So I would say to you that real change is coming, and there is a prime example of how it has influenced the NFB to do better and be better for the industry for the future.
Yeah, wise words indeed, James, and a really good run through all those actions which people ought to be taking account of at any point in the industry, wherever they work. Though that's sage advice. And certainly for the benefits of membership of organisations like the NFB, it's there to support the industry to, as you say, to professionalise it and make it comply with statutory legislation. James, it's been a really, really interesting conversation today. I've really enjoyed understanding a bit more about the Building Safety Act and some of the challenges that we've got within the sector, but also I'm really buoyed up by your positive confidence that the industry is getting to grips with it, and that the chances of a repeat of Grenfell Tower are significantly reduced on the new buildings that have been built today. So thank you for your time today, and wish you every luck going forward.
Thanks, Mark.
That's all. It's been a pleasure.